So in the Angolan colobus, those huge groups, that seems, I mean, it really seems very puzzling because unless the predation pressure was so much higher there than elsewhere, it seems sort of unlikely, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, even red colobus, where they form larger groups in forests where chimps hunt them, they're going up to like 100, maybe 120, but 300 seems, yeah, exaggerated. So, yeah, I don't know that it could be entirely chimpanzee predation pressure at all. And I can also say that we never saw a chimps hunting colobus, although there were 6 or 7 chimpanzee species that colobus fur was, or fur that was sort of black and white was found in, which we assumed was colobus. Yeah, I think you're right. It's probably unlikely to just be chimpanzee predation.
And these are stable groupings, do you know?
As far as we can tell. The problem with the study, actually the reason the study came to an end was that the colobus moved so far, their home range was so semi-nomadic that eventually the WCS park staff couldn't follow them anymore. And those guys are pretty tough. I mean, you know, when I go out with them, you know, it was like literally sometimes 3 hours just to get to the monkeys. And then 3 hours back over this really horrible terrain with lots of terrestrial herbaceous vegetation. So I knew that that was not a good long-term study site. But yeah, it's eventually the study just came to an end because they moved so far that they couldn't follow them anymore.
So in the Angolan population, is there any within-group dominance hierarchy, like in reference to the contest competition question?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually nobody's managed to study the behavior. Like, we literally knew maybe 3 individuals. There was one who was missing part of her tail, and like, but they're not on the ground in front of you. Like with geladas, you can learn the individuals, but with those colobus, I mean, it would take someone really, really with a keen eye to be able to recognize. Even we don't know if the 300-member groups are actually one big group, or are they like a bunch of, you know, one male units, kind of like in the geladas or some of the snub-nosed monkeys. So, yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, this is really just scratching the surface of what the Angolan colobus are doing. They're a tough study species, but it'd be great if someone did a serious study of them.
So what, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to follow up. As another possible explanation, what do you know about continuity with other forest habitats, for example? I'm just thinking that maybe this aggregation could be compression potentially, you know, based on habitat loss or disturbance and threats from other areas, especially if there was a refugee situation.
Well, Nyungwe, yeah, I think it's possible. Nyungwe is really big, like it's almost 1,000 square kilometers, and it's also, there's a forest in Burundi on its southern border that is contiguous called, I think, Kabira, which is also a couple hundred square kilometers, so it's a pretty big forest. But the other thing I should say is there are some colobus groups at Nyungwe that have been reported just during surveys that were smaller, that were like 50 animals or so forth. So not all of them are huge. There's several really big ones that are known. And then there's also some really small ones that aren't very well known. So maybe something's going on in that corner of the forest in the northwest where we're studying them. But I don't think it's like necessarily people sort of compressing them together, because there's a lot of other locations where colobus occur where they're really compressed into little fragments, and there the groups are usually pretty small. But, I mean, they also have to do, I mean, I think Thimble was right about the food is very high quality, but maybe something to do with the way it's distributed allows them to live in these giant aggregations, but then why those costs don't outweigh it, it's really difficult to disentangle. And they don't do this anywhere else in Africa. All the groups are always like less than 25 or so.
What causes or what do you think causes the large groups in the gelada?
Them, I think it may be predation, because they literally live above the tree line. So when a predator comes, all they can do is run as fast as they can to the cliffside. And that actually happens sometimes with domestic dogs. Even though Guasa is pretty intact, there are farms about 5 miles away. And sometimes the dogs have gone wild and they try to kill the geladas. And you know, they'll ambush them from, like the geladas will be like almost a kilometer from their sleeping cliff. And the dogs will ambush them in packs of like 3 or 4 and chase them as fast as they can. And the geladas, you know, eventually they'll pick out one gelada to take out of the group and eat it. So it's almost like dilution effect, perhaps, where they just live in this giant herd and then they just have no protection from predators other than turning on the predator and attacking it, but they don't do that with the dogs. They just run and run and run as fast as they can to the cliff. So.
On the black and white colobus, the slide with the distribution of group sizes went by pretty fast, but most of them were in one male groups. Do I remember that right?
You mean in my Cacomega study?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, the two that I had feeding data were on one male groups. So those are the only ones I could test the resource defense hypothesis.
I'm more interested in this idea that the females are choosing the males that are doing the good work on the resource defense. So if they live in one male groups, then that means that, so do females move between groups?
Yeah, that's another really good question, which I had anecdotal observations of a female and her young juvenile sort of approaching my group and being pushed away by the females in the group for a several day period, and then she just disappeared and floated off into the forest again. There was 3 anecdotes of females moving around by themselves in the forest that I had during my study, but never a female successfully transferring into one of my groups. And Tara Harris recently did a genetic study for the Kabali colobus and found that male transfer is more common, but that there is evidence that females do seem to be transferring at low rates. So some of it does occur, but I don't think it's a regular phenomenon for females to pick up and leave their groups.
Well, but so if that's true, and if most groups are one male groups, it doesn't seem like there's much opportunity for females to reward the males. They're doing all this defense work, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the question is, does it happen? It's not like they can leave as soon as the guy becomes a bad research defender. That I didn't really see. But I think it's conceivable that they could leave occasionally if they're sort of displeased with what's going on in their group.
So Mike Wilson gave a talk about the chimpanzees, and his story was that not that the males were after copulations, but they were after increased reproductive success by the females, right? So by raising the size of the territory. So you didn't mention that. Is that a possibility with these guys, or?
I mean, I think that's where I think that's a really not. It's a much more conclusive study than mine because it actually shows a fitness benefit for the females. And that was the work that Jennifer Williams and Ann Pusey did at Gombe, and Mike's been working there in recent years as well. Yeah, I mean, that's much more of a compelling case to me that shows a fitness benefit because the males expand the territory, the quality of the resources they showed were higher as the territory got larger, there's more food available, and then also females in those groups with bigger ranges had more offspring. So, yeah, I mean, it's a nice sort of open and shut case of resource defense.
I wonder whether you think about comparison with Hamadryas baboons, since they have these 4 parts from missing a male, female, to the big herds when they sit at the sleeping wall, but they separate during the day, while the geladas might not do it.
Right.
And it also seems, if I recollect correctly, the geladas have rather female dominated. So if they don't like the male, they can chase him away, which never would happen with Hamadryas males. So they have many similarities, but striking differences, and that might be interesting in interpreting the results. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think Hamadryas versus geladas is really interesting, and there are people, I think Colmenares, the European researcher, has written about speculating regarding the evolution of these 2 different baboon-like creatures, like Hamadryas being baboons and geladas being somewhat related to them. But nobody's really done a lot of empirical studies comparing them. And of course, one thing I was mentioning to Joan before my talk was that our geladas at Guasa, which we haven't published yet, but the females, the whole idea of female power, which seems to be really their evidence for in the Simeon Mountains where they've been studied in the past. At Guasa, we see males herding females, biting them. When there's a takeover, we don't see any sign that the females are involved at all in who the next male is going to be. It may be, there may be more behavioral variation within the geladas than what has been published to date. So, but yeah, I think the comparisons to Hamadryas is really interesting.
I wonder if you could sort of step back from your own studies and comment on what's been called the crisis in primate socioecology, as the question as to whether, at least with respect to the sort of fine-grained details of social organization, which I know you don't study so much, but like the extent of nepotism and the extent to which the dominant style, the extent to which dominance tolerates subordinates. There's more and more thought, especially people like Bernard Thierry, that ecological variables like food distribution and predation pressure just don't explain it, and the only thing you can explain it is phylogenetic history. But others still hold to the socio-ecological model. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, given that I had a study that came out sort of not fitting the socio-ecological models, I thought Thierry's paper was very interesting. That he came out and said that he thinks nothing's ever going to fit. They'll build new models and they'll never fit. But I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. That ecology can explain some behavior, but I do wonder with intergroup encounters, because I haven't looked at it at the big picture, but with intergroup encounters, in the colobus, the evidence from the colobus greza, in a population at Kakamega, which I didn't mention, but the ones I studied, they actually eat a lot of fruit certain times of year. So there'll be periods where they eat 80% fruit, and then when the fruit disappears, they're back to eating 80% leaves. But they do like it when it's available. Whereas the colobus in Kibale are entirely folivorous throughout the year, just always eating leaves. And so one reason that Tara thought a study doing intergroup encounters would be interesting there was because someone could argue, well, at Kakamega there's an incentive to defend food because it's a very fruity diet at certain times of year. But then she found it at Kibale as well, which makes you start thinking, well, two very different resource distribution patterns, and yet the same sort of evidence for male resource defense. And her evidence is clearer because she used endocrine monitoring. She's now done some genetic work on transfer patterns. So she's definitely improved on the study that I did. But the end result is sort of the same. Males are defending resources. And then there's also evidence from Colobus velorosus in Ghana, where there appears to be some evidence for infanticide defense, but there's also Julie Tykrove recently, in one of her papers, she published evidence that a female transferred from a male who did a bad job at resource defense to a group where the male was better, I guess, or they had a better quality territory at least. So it's sort of anecdotal, but it's conceivable that in the colobus monkeys that there's a phylogenetic history of defending resources. And one of the things that I know that Julie's hoping to do is do a similar study on the Southeast Asian colubrine with Andreas Koenig on the Feierslanger and see if they're also doing male resource defense. In which case, then perhaps it's a colubrine thing. So, yeah, I think that theory is an interesting argument, which kind of started with De Fiore and Rendell, I think. And so, yeah, it definitely. I never heard it called a crisis, but I think that's probably what it is. Thanks.
With the colobus, I was wondering, there was a study about this mixture of colobus and Indiana monkeys, and the benefit of the one which is more rather nervous and blocking, and the other is faster. So wondering whether the one group that seems to be an outlier might be the only group who is not around Diana monkeys and do not mix, so they won't have these benefits that mixed groups have. I think Bashari and...
Yeah, Bashari and Noe. Yeah, that was a red colobus group that he studied that mixed with Diana monkeys, which they do a lot, it seems, in parts of West Africa. And yeah, I guess the black-white colobus at Nyungwe, there are some Gwenin species, but there's no Diana monkeys, so they don't occur in Central Africa. But they don't seem to form mixed species associations with them. So it could be a way to deal with that problem. They can't have mixed species groups when they have a bigger, but still 300 seems really, really big.
So I missed something about the comparison between the bachelor groups and the mixed sex groups. So are they different sizes? Are the bachelor groups more likely to be low status males that pose less of a threat or more of a threat? What exactly was the mechanism?
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that the reason why I consider bachelor males to be a greater threat is because they don't have regular access to females. So, and typically they were kind of, I don't know, ghost-like in the forest. Like they would show up for a few days and you'd see them, hanging around, then they disappear, and you wonder where they went. Because for a while I was trying to follow bachelor groups to like get some data on them, but it was just impossible because they were traveling over much larger areas. But the idea is that if it's a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 bachelor males traveling around together, that they might have an interest in taking over a group because they have no access to females, whereas another male in another bisexual group would have already access to females, so less of an incentive.
And that's usually how takeovers happen. They happen from bachelor groups taking over.
Right. Well, as far as we know, again, these forest monkeys are really hard to say for sure. I mean, John Oates saw evidence of male takeovers, but I don't think he ever actually saw the takeover. And I never saw a takeover, but males were deposed, and you assume that it's not someone you recognized, and you assume they came in from a bachelor group. Yeah, that's why it's nice to study July. You have a better idea of what's going on all the time.
So with regard to the female choice argument, I'm sympathetic that they're nocturnal copulators, and therefore that the data set is very small. But don't you need to somehow control for opportunity too? Because if females are in large groups, there are many more opportunities to copulate within a group than outside of a group. It seems like you'd have to have a very large sample before you'd even be able to know, just based on opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that's I'm saying that may be going on, but I would never want to say conclusively. Like, I feel reasonably confident at this point that males appear to be more aggressive when they're in an area of important food resources. Whether females then choose males as their mates, or yeah, I just don't have the data set to do that. And I think even in Tara Harris's subsequent study in Kibale, that's also a part that's difficult. And all of her groups tended to be one male groups as well. So, yeah, I think that's a weak link in the argument for sure.
So where are all those other male black and white colobus?
They just seem to be roaming the forest. The ones who are bachelors?
Yeah, I mean, they don't seem to be very, you'd think that, so if the sex ratio is more or less even at birth, I actually know what the black and white sex ratio is at birth. So it's a little bit male biased in contrast to the red colobus. But there's a lot of extra guys, not in groups, right? And yet you're rarely seeing them.
Yeah,
That's weird.
Well, this one group, BS, had its share of,
they're all there,
males
right?
for some reason.
Yeah.
That was a really chaotic group. And that was also the group that never engaged in
saw that.
intense aggression.
Yeah,
I think it was like a collective action problem where nobody was willing to like take charge and do anything. So they just sat around and got bullied by the other groups. But yeah, I mean, I would see the bachelors occasionally in the forest, but typically I just think they were traveling, I mean, unless they weren't surviving after birth because of being on their own and so forth. But, yeah, they were very elusive.
They play video games.
Other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.